Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 3 of the Zscaler Virtual CXO Summit Series, Productivity, Efficiency, and Speed, Why Digital Experience Matters. If you have any technical questions, please reach out to cxosummit@zscaler.com. This is a public session, and we will be sharing the recording afterwards. And the opinions expressed in the discussion by third parties are solely those of the guest and not necessarily those of Zscaler. Zscaler does not guarantee the accuracy or reliability of the information disclosed during the discussion. Please continue to share after the event today and follow using the hashtag Zscaler CXO Summit. We are excited to have you be a part of today's conversation. Please participate by submitting your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and responding to polling questions throughout the sessions. You will now see your first polling question today. Now, please join me in welcoming EVP of Customer Experience and Transformation, Kavitha Mariappan.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third and final episode of Zscaler's virtual CXO Summit Summer Series. The new enterprise CXO priorities: protect valuable data, optimize performance, and preserve the environment. Today, we'll discuss productivity, efficiency, and speed, and why digital experience matters. Improving user experience to ensure productivity is an important C-level mandate, but it is increasingly difficult to monitor and troubleshoot user performance issues as applications and infrastructure move into the cloud and outside of the immediate site of IT. That is where digital experience monitoring, or DEM tools, become a critical and crucial part of IT visibility. In a moment, we'll discuss the importance of visibility into cloud and mobile-based infrastructure, and to optimize user experience with our esteemed panel of CXO leaders: Rohit Adlaka, former Chief Digital and Information Officer and Global Head at Wipro, and Howard Sherrington, the Executive Product Manager and Network and Security at BBC formerly. Following the panel, Dhaval Sharma, Vice President of Product Management at Zscaler, will walk us through how Zscaler Digital Experience, or ZDX, provide insight into the digital experience of employees and helps IT improve performance. But first, let us kick off our CXO Perspectives panel. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce my colleague and our moderator today, Sanjit Ganguli, Vice President of Product Management at Zscaler. Sanjit, please take it away.
Thank you, Kavitha, and a huge thank you to Rohit and Howard for what will sure to be a wonderful and insightful panel discussion today. So to set the stage on the challenges that we all face when it comes to digital experience, think about how the world has changed over the last several years. We used to live in a world where users were most likely on a trusted network, maybe working from an office. Applications were hosted in a data center that you had some control over. But all that's different now. Users are literally anywhere and everywhere, with COVID more likely from home. And applications are hosted in any number of locations: in the data center, public cloud, private cloud, SaaS, IaaS, PaaS. And that's created a massive visibility gap for enterprise IT. The ability to guarantee digital experience has become very difficult when many of the components that enforce digital experience, like the network, like the servers, like the desktops, are no longer, or potentially no longer, under IT's control. At the same time, digital transformation has accelerated. Billions of dollars are being poured into digital transformation efforts with new applications and services that aim to improve the ways that customers interact with your business. But how do you ensure that the experience of this digital transformation is retained? That applications are fast, employees are productive and resilient while dealing with all this complexity. So that is what we were going to discuss today with our esteemed panel. And so let me pose a question to start, and maybe Rohit, I'll look to you first. Talk to us about your former organization's digital transformation journey. As you digitized or went down this path, first of all, tell us about the journey, and then B, how did digital experience play a part as part of that transformation?
So Sanjit, if it's okay, I'll take a minute to talk about the larger picture and then zero down onto the corporate world. So,
Sure.
the fourth industrial revolution has ushered in what we call the digital age. And the whole idea about speed and instant gratification, what we call for the millennial world, has actually entered the corporate world also. And people are really not differentiating between the corporate and the personal world. So let's look at what, digital first means to people. Different people have different connotations. And I feel that the word digital itself is a misnomer because it's just a combination of zeros and ones. But actually, digital is infinite possibilities of transforming an organization, transforming a world, and being able to drive user experience as the center rather than technology as a center, which is the way we've been driving the industry till now. So speeds have gone haywire. People have tested 170 Tbps in terms of speed, which means all of Netflix content can be downloaded in 1 second. And if you come back to your corporate network, which is still giving you 100 Mbps, people have an absolute mismatch in terms of expectation. So the first is that how do you bring in the freedom of choice for employees? And my former organization, is now more than 200,000 people. So 200,000 people to please is not an easy task. So how do you make sure you give them freedom of choice of network, of laptops? Everyone wanted Apple machines, of browsers, of mail clients, with least amount of security agents sitting on the desktop or laptop. Now that's a big challenge to actually go ahead and meet. But if you ask me what has transformed in the last 4 to 5 years in the corporate world, the network has changed from the corporate network to the open internet. Your data center has moved in, from your premises of having thousands and thousands of server farms, has moved on to the cloud. So how do you take care of what we call the app economy, the subscription economy, the freemium economy back in the corporate world itself, where everything is app-based as a widget? How do you manage those expectations with the speed, with the independence of device, and with least amount of security payload back onto the machine is the challenge that I've gone through, and I'm sure a lot of other people are going through too.
Yes, it's a great information, and I blame in some ways the iPhone. The Apple has made a device that's so simple that people, the expectations that enterprise IT is going to be as simple as an iPhone has really set and made expectations somewhat unrealistic for systems that are often quite complex. Howard, how about for you, for your former organization? Walk us through kind of what you view as the digital transformation journey and how you viewed digital experience as part of that journey.
Sure. I mean, I think it's probably worth pointing out first that most companies, the BBC included, aren't IT companies. They consume IT in the same way that they would other utilities. And change is implemented to empower the business, but I think sometimes it's implemented to meet an immediate business need without either a full strategy behind it or a full understanding of the implications of doing it. So I think something like SaaS services or public cloud, there's an initial use case, and then those services evolve regardless of what the business wants them to do. So you have to keep pace with that. And I think that was a fundamental mindset shift for the business, really. I think transformation is absolutely everywhere, and I think a lot of the user base suffer from transformation fatigue and feel like things are being done to them. As opposed to being part of that journey, and that's a wider cultural challenge. And I definitely think that cultural change needs to go alongside technology change. And it's easy to sit within an IT function, as I did, and say, "Oh, let's do all these exciting, shiny things." But really, are you breaking workflows? Are you ensuring that your business can still do the things that it always needs to do? And I think that because of the way that a lot of businesses are funded, particularly large businesses, I mean, the BBC was 30,000 users, so not quite on the scale of the 200,000 that Rahit mentioned. But still, it has silos of people that are very focused on the things that they do. And when you're doing mass company-wide IT change, it's sometimes difficult to get people to realise and look above the parapet and understand why you're doing that change and why they need to transform their service to be in line with the wider change that you're making. I think from my experience, the change will happen regardless, because it has to. You have to stay competitive, and the world is changing all around us, whether it's driven by security or new business requirements. So I think the long-term strategic vision, fully aligned to your business vision, is important. So you don't just bend to pressures when people say, I don't want to do this, I want to resist it. And there's certainly elements of that at the BBC in my experience, but we also managed to achieve a great deal of change by combining that cultural change alongside technology change and always linking it back to the business vision. Otherwise, why are we doing it?
Yeah, that's great, Howard. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Oftentimes, as technologists, it's difficult to keep the business vision in mind. Like, why are we doing something technically sound, which may actually not advance the business? And it's important to always keep the business value front and center. But let's double click a little bit on what you said around the silos, because I think when you talk about digital experience, the digital experience, the way we define it is, I, as a user of the services that my organization provides me to be a productive employee, need to be reliable, need to be fast, and need to be productive, right? That means response times are super fast. That means if I have downtime or outages, I get quick resolution. Now, when you're going down that path, like you mentioned, silos, there are so many moving parts to ensure digital experience. There's my desktop, there's my network connection, there's my Wi-Fi, there's my local ISP, there's my internet backbone, there's the server farm, there's the cloud, right? There's the security piece of the security stack. So Rohit, maybe to start with you, how do you think about those silos, right? There are, you had head of network, head of desktop, head of server, head of security. All of these are, working together, but they also have, their own agendas in certain cases. What advice, or how do you think about, bridging silos or creating a environment where the digital experience is front and center among a lot of these different types of organizations or groups?
From a user perspective, the answer was very simple. Anything went wrong, they said network is an issue, and I'm sure Howard will be able to relate to that. So, organizations are complex. So you have the front office, the middle office, the back office. You have technology silos. Sometimes the CIO and CISO functions don't see eye to eye, and it's extremely hard to please the end user collectively. So the challenge, comes in when 200,000 people means that you have 200,000 expectations. So how do you, first of all, manage the balance between standardization and giving something which is dedicated or very, very personalized? That's the first mismatch. You go to developer A, he or she may want different tools for development, perhaps a Mac machine, like I said, which is premium. You go to developer B, who's happy with a thin client itself. How do you manage the standardization, which is challenge number one. Challenge number two is how to give speed. And corporate networks are, still not designed for 1 Gbps speeds and higher, still toggling between 10 and 100 Mbps. In the branch offices, it could be as low as 1 Mbps. It still gives you total quality video, but that's not experience, what we call. The third challenge is location. And especially in the last 1.5 years of COVID, what had taught me that people expect the same level of user experience, even if they're sitting at home. So how do you manage security? And we had a challenge that, do you load the applications plus what we call the security posture in terms of agents on the end user device, and make it so watertight that the user can't breathe, but the CISO is happy. So managing user experience on the device with tons and tons of antivirus and proxies and DLPs, you name it, encryption, you have agents, all available. The fourth, I would say, is how do you bring in nimbleness? How do you, what I call, stitch together the front office, middle office, and back office? And for example, if it's an HR PAR, user who's using SAP at the back end, and he or she can't, afford to visit office, but you still need to have security at the end user and also at the network. How do you manage PAR users, like this, which focus on very, very specific applications. And the last is, since everything was on the cloud, workloads keep shifting from one cloud provider to the other. So this inter-cloud movement of data, of security, of network, makes it extremely challenging. And if I have to put an overlay of security on top of that, of all these disparate networks and people and silos, it does become very, very challenging. So I think we have to draw a fine balance between what we call user experience and security. We did go ahead and manage and implement, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little more in terms of the zero trust framework where we just started. And the idea was that how do you implement security in everything that you do, right from a simple email to an SAP transaction for committing on the financial numbers at the end of the year. Not an easy task. So we had to take everyone along. We had to be a little gentle before the push, but sometimes you have to just pull the plug and tell people this is the way it's got to be done, and that's it.
It's a great point. And yeah, you bring up a very interesting point about the fine balance that needs to be struck between experience and security, right? I mean, and if you want to be fully secure, it often means sacrificing experience, but then you might reach a point where the experience is so unwieldy that no one wants to use it. And there's a fine balance to be struck there. And we'll definitely dive into that a little bit further. But Howard, how for you in your former organization around dealing with all these moving parts between between the network, the security, the desktop, the application? I'm a network guy. I've taken my fair share of blame for problems that had nothing to do with the network. You're a network guy. Talk us through kind of some best practices or the challenges that you had to deal with.
Sure. So I'd probably split them into several groups. There was the people that were used to working remotely already. There was the technical users that need to change their workflows. And there was business users who'd never worked from home. So they were kind of quite wedded to being in the office, and everything was built around that. And I think with all of those silos, everyone accepted some level of change, but we had to really, particularly throughout lockdown and similar to Rohit, we were trying to adopt zero trust across the business. And really, it was striking that balance. I agree with everything Rohit said, but striking that balance between what I call top-down delivery as opposed to bottom-up. And the BBC can be very guilty at times of doing bottom-up, where you ask everyone's permission whether it's okay to do something, rather than impose a decision from the top and everyone from the chief exec down backs you to implement that. And I think striking that right balance is transcends IT. It's around communication, it's around updating processes, it's around engaging all the right teams, InfoSec, service assurance, managed service providers if you have them. So I think there was different speeds or lanes of change for different groups of people, really. And I think trying to understand that from a central IT point of view was fairly paramount to actually delivering some change. And I think the days of doing things in a waterfall way, dare I say it, agile, but in the true sense of the word, where you can deliver a minimum viable product, you can do things iteratively, was quite empowering, really, because we could start to enact IT change without having to do absolutely everything in one and then switch it on and fingers crossed at the end of it. So I think that was quite a powerful transition. And I think a lot of SaaS services and public cloud consumption allow you to do that much more. But I think, there was anecdotal evidence about people not being able to work with the new workflows. And I guess a lot of those were unfounded, but they did take time to diagnose. And that's where I think some of the processes lagged behind actually the change that was happening. So things like service desk processes, knowledge base and things like that, it was eating up inordinate amount of times for people to the service desk to troubleshoot things. And as you say, it may have been people's home Wi-Fi. It may have been someone had an incident where someone's son had put in a home VPN and they were popping out in Norway and they just couldn't understand why they were getting Norwegian internet. There's all these sorts of things that took days, if not weeks in some instances, to try and find out. And it was largely down to a lack of visibility, where I think a lot of the tools that we had, either in endpoints, so the multiple agents running on things, or looking at network flows and things like that, they were all predicated on people being on the network, or certainly on the network some of the time. And as soon as everyone wasn't, then you've got a problem, really. And so I think, you know, it took a lot of adapting, and I think there was a lot of process catch up, a lot of comms that needs to do to take people on that journey. And I think some things were done tactically to meet, you know, immediate business challenges, particularly when everyone, you know, went into lockdown. People accepted a level of change, but then it became the norm, and then people expected better performance. So it was you know, it was a great journey, but you know, it wasn't without challenge. It wasn't quite as smooth as you'd have done it perhaps in normal times.
No, yeah, great feedback. And, you know, the thing you bring up around process is so interesting, right? I mean, you can always throw technology at a problem, but unless you have the process and truthfully the skills, right? I mean, the skills and process are often just as important as the technology when you're trying to deal with these challenges. So I think, so now that we've, you know, covered a lot of the challenges, right, that we faced, you know, the interesting technological changes that have happened is the emergence of these digital experience monitoring solutions, right? And this is you think about DEM as a market segment, digital experience monitoring, it's a term Gartner introduced a few years ago. And if you look at, you know, the growth in certain areas of monitoring, DEM is probably the hottest area of monitoring right now. And what digital experience monitoring promises is from the perspective of your employee, what experience are they getting accessing applications? And if there is a degradation, where are those degradations coming from, right? So that's essentially what these tool sets do. Now, one of the byproducts of that, given the world we live in, and Rohit, I'll ask you first, a lot of problems are outside the remit of IT. So if one of your users, like Howard, you mentioned, is having a home Wi-Fi issue or a local ISP issue, that's not really under the remit of IT, but they need to be a productive worker from home. And so there's a challenge, inherent challenge there between where does a corporate network really end, what is really under your control or not. And Rohit, so you know, as you saw this transition from, you know, to lockdown, how do you think about kind of the line, the demarcation of where does corporate IT stop and start in terms of dealing with a modern world where users can be accessing these services and need to be productive from virtually anywhere?
On a lighter note, you know, we had this discussion of what is the definition of IT. And my boss had a very simple definition. He said anything which has a switch is IT. So you really can't differentiate between, you know, where does it start and where does it end? Because when you're trying to get in 200,000 people to work remotely with customer networks plus home networks plus corporate networks all intertwined, lines are blurred. You really have no boundaries, you know, anymore. You're responsible for everything. So that's the baseline that we started off with. But the challenge, the first, I would say 1.5, 2 months was that how do you get people productive? So right from shipping the machines from offices to getting them what we call, you know, dongles, if you're familiar with that, to getting them, you know, internet wired connections, to getting them mobile hotspots, it was a real scurry to get 200,000 people activated. So once the basic infrastructure was set up, that's when the network started bursting. One is that the telcos themselves couldn't cater for the load. They had designed for corporate lease lines. They were never, you know, looking at, if you look at India alone, there are more than 4 million people, you know, working in IT. How do you get them connected through home networks? The networks couldn't withstand. The third issue was that people are all protected within the corporate networks, right from perimeter firewall and a WAF backend to your endpoint protection. And suddenly the internet, you know, is your network. So your firewalls and VPN networks just couldn't take the load. So when you have such complex loopbacks between data centers, between cloud providers and external networks, how do you pinpoint, you know, where the challenge is? Because ultimately, like I said at the beginning, it's the user who's paramount, not the network. Network is incidental. Though we feel from an IT perspective, you know, that's the best thing to happen to humankind. So, you know, we looked at deployment of, it started off with end user monitoring tools, which was as simple as looking at latency of request response of a transaction. And then we evolved to what we call a user experience monitoring, UXM, you know, which is what You also have a similar concept, within Zscaler itself. How do you bring in that different disparate parts together, especially when competitive partners don't see eye to eye? So the applications versus the network versus the data center versus partner A versus partner B. Is your application agent based or agentless? Multiple. How much of bandwidth does it take? How much of compute part does it take on the end user desktop or laptop? So we had multiple questions, but I think it was a diktat that we had, that if you keep it user centric, you're able to pinpoint where the challenge is, link it back to the multiple monitoring tools through a single console, and give a visibility to the end user team, which then works with the backend teams as to network and corporate security as to where the problem lies. I think that visibility used to be great. We also had behavioral issues, which we could take care of through these tools. For example, people used to say my network is actually not working, or it's an issue with the backend application. But it turned out that they just wanted to take a day off, or they were watching too much of YouTube, or downloading movies, back on their network, and hence people just couldn't, cater to that. So a lot of behavioral issues and trust issues, were kind of sorted out. And now there's a clear linkage between user experience, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, employee retention, productivity, and overall revenue of the company. So I think it's been a fairly big boon to the entire team to be able to have one common console can then drive end to end.
Yeah, that's great. And I love how you linked that, how digital experience links to productivity and ultimately links to revenue, right? I mean, it's all ultimately a business decision, a business factor there at the end of the day. How about for your organization when it came to, dealing with the fact that, many of the challenges you were dealing with were outside the remit of BBC, Wi-Fi and in local ISP, for example? Like, how did you deal with those challenges? And especially, I would say, with your former organization, with how dispersed and distributed I would guess your workforce is, given reporters in certain locations, right? I would imagine it was a very distributed workforce that you had to deal with.
Definitely. And I think for a portion of the workforce, of the people that I mentioned that never worked from home before, just getting laptops to them in the first place was a challenge. I mean, getting hold of laptops in the marketplace was a challenge. They were a hot commodity, and so their digital experience was essentially zero, or it was whatever experience they had at home through Outlook Web Access or something like that. Some people working on mobile phones. So that was a terrible digital experience for them, and that was overcome with literally build factories of people just putting the image on machines and shipping them out, and it was a great effort. So I think setting that baseline is hugely important. As you say, there's a lot of people used to working remotely anyway, the journalists, and they were fairly comfortable with what's with the way that they worked. But I think the ones that were really impacted were the people that did actual production. So there was high bandwidth, low latency applications that were basically predicated on you being on network, sat right next to it on a high powered workstation. And now you're on a laptop with limited capability, and the performance isn't as good. And I think some of that was expectation setting, and some of it was really trying to find workarounds. And unfortunately, we did end up with around 2,000 people that simply had to come into the office because it was the only way to keep the TV on, basically. So there was that element of it. I think the other things, though, that all fed into digital experience were there'd been a long-standing identity program. And so people were used to authenticating in the same way. There was a consistency across that in front of a lot of applications, and that kind of trust profile wrapped around the user pre-existed people going to work from home, really, and people were comfortable working with it. So that was a real positive. But I think aside from the IT, user experience really was seen as a one-off thing that was done as part of a project. You do your UX testing at the end of something that you deployed, and then it was good to go for the business. It wasn't really seen as an ongoing thing that should, be part and parcel of the evolution of the service. And I think that was a real fundamental mindset change for people. And a question I started to ask people a lot when they bring problems to me, and being a network guy, but also responsible for some of our SaaS tools, they'd often come to me and I'd push back at them and say, could you do this remotely before? And the answer was often no. So I'm saying, well, yeah, what baseline have you got to say that it's worse then? So that was then a point of discussion that, well, how do we make it better together rather than a confrontational situation? So I think there's elements of giving people the tools that they need to do the job, but also breaking mindsets away from the way it's always worked, and trying to find new and innovative ways of making things work in the new age. Because let's face it, this is as terrible as it's been, it's a great opportunity to enact change while there's hardly any users in the office. And I think people are now used to working remotely. They're used to working with these SaaS tools. And there's a real foundational capability now that has been built on and can continue to be built on for years to come, really, because people, I don't think, will ever go back in the same way.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And Howard, you bring up two really interesting points there. One is around those baselines. So, when you hear the dreaded, this application is slow, what does slow really mean? Slow today is the new down, right? Slow, it means many things. It's not particularly objective. So let me ask, and then the other point is around the high bandwidth requirements, right? There are certain things that will never be possible from home, for example, right? And you have to make the decision whether, there are certain applications requirements that do require someone being in an office. But Rohit, let me ask you, and you brought it up briefly before around, the different tools and managing different tools. Digital experience monitoring tools bring an objective measurement to the user experience. So we are, so DEM tools literally measure, response times. They measure the experience. But traditional IT has always been around other factors, right? So if you look at more traditional tools, you would measure bandwidth, you would measure CPU utilization, memory utilization, you would measure, IO, right? Throughput. At the end of the day, you could have very high CPU and memory utilization, but your employees are perfectly getting great performance, or completely opposite. How do you, what kind of best practices would you see when you try to operationalize end user experience? And just like Howard said, it's often thought of as an afterthought, but how do you move the needle from thinking about all my dials are green because my CPU and memory and throughput is low, versus keying on user experiences being the main metric that you care about?
I think, Sanjit, first we have to step back and say, what is the definition of user experience? Like you correctly said, people have been measuring it with bandwidth and latency, and they expect that an IT metric will give you a green in terms of employee sat also, which is not the case. All of us know that. Exactly. We call it the watermelon effect, which means all your IT SLAs are green and user satisfaction is red from inside. Right. So I think we step back and we first held an open survey, and I think that was very bold of the team, to go and ask end users. Normally people are very shy of asking end users, and they take ESAT from just a sample of people. But I think the team was bold enough to put it to all people in the company, saying, tell us, what do you mean by user experience? And different answers came. One came the traditional route that I want speed. I want the speed the way I watch or download a movie. I want that for an application. But ultimately, if you look at it, user experience is a combination of speed, combination of automation, because you don't want to go through cumbersome workflows, whether it's software development versus ordering a laptop. People want do it yourself in terms of user experience, which means just like an Amazon, you have all the menus available. I don't know how many of you have actually called an Amazon person, or, you've got a call back from them, because everything is so menu driven. And people are used to that, rather than standing in queue for an IVR and getting to a human agent to, go ahead and solve your problem. So people are looking at a combination of speed, combination of experience, which is your machine that you end up using, a combination of least security, posture with the highest security access. And then ultimately they want to do it yourself through automation and AI. if you're able to bind in all these parameters, and it's not easy for a complex organization, then you can get down to the true expectation of what we call, user experience management. So the challenge is, how do you move away from IT SLAs to employee psyche and employee retention? And how do you move in from, pure KPI metrics to the human feeling through automation? So for example, we had launched a bot because people had questions, how do you bring in my laptop? Is it safe to enter office? I'm in a red zone as far as COVID is concerned. So they want to first get past all their fears. So we actually released a bot, conversational engine, to solve all their issues, information plus transaction. And that human element, got in a lot of praise, and then people started embracing, IT more and more. So the idea was that how do you bring in the whole organization to serve the employees rather than just a fledgling, few thousand people trying to service. And I'll just end my answer with a very interesting example. We had people offering help from all walks of life to manage, user experience. For example, HR and recruitment. You wouldn't believe it. They sat in conference rooms, of course, with social distancing, along with the IT team, and they ended up, what Howard said, imaging desktops and laptops. So we gave them a crash course of 24 hours of how to switch on and how to power on the machine and how do you load an image, and got people productive when you have to make 200,000 people, up and running. So everyone helped in, and these small gestures actually added on to what we call the user experience.
Yeah, and it goes to show how critical IT is to the success of an organization. Rohit, I'm also never going to look at a watermelon the same way again. I love that analogy, and I'm going to borrow it if you don't mind, because I think it's brilliant. Green on the outside, but red on the inside. It's amazing.
Sure.
Howard, how about for you? So the mindset shift between typical IT SLAs that often aren't tied to user experience. How did you shift from UX being kind of an afterthought or maybe it's still in progress, making it first and foremost in the process?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in some respects we were hamstrung not by any technical challenge, but by the contracts we had with our managed service provider, which were very much SLA KPI driven, based on a certain percentage of users being in the office and people being able to walk up to their desks or them to be able to drop their laptop in at the help desk. So there was certainly a challenge there around what we were measuring and why we were measuring it. I also lost count of the number of people who would send me speed test results from their personal devices and their corporate device, and I was supposed to deep diagnose what was wrong from that. But that fell away a bit, really, and I think what was important through it all was communication. And I think one of the things that I made sure to do was make myself accountable for the decisions that I made around the changes that we made, whether they be tactical or strategic, but accept constructive criticism as a lever for improvement, really. And that's really a key part of being a leader in any walk of life, but particularly in IT, when things are changing so fast, make yourself accountable. And that was fairly well regarded by the business, because the animosity against change started to melt away, really, and people became more constructive in the way that they'd work. I mean, there was a large volume of stuff, so I couldn't necessarily handle it all on my own. But I think people valued having that route to someone who was prepared to be bold and prepared to articulate to any level, from C-level right down to end users, why we were doing things and why they needed to change. Because ultimately, I think what's the alternative? I mean, change is going to happen. There was nothing we could do about working from home. It had to change. So there was vast improvements for people once they saw the benefits that they could get, and they enjoyed the flexibility of working from home. And once the IT processes caught up with them, with the change that was going on, it was actually a much better user experience that people grew to really value. And now I don't think there were surveys done at the beginning and throughout the lockdown periods, and at first it was people wanted to come back into the office, and then towards the end it was, well, I'd like to work flexibly. I don't need to be there all the time. I do have the tools that I need to do my job now. And that's a really great success story for not just IT, but the processes, the service assurance, the infosec, all coming together to make things work really. And I've got to say, it was great to be part of that journey. Really, it was fairly fraught at times, but it was also really rewarding. And I think the business is in a much better place from that. Well, accelerated journey, but it's really set people thinking that things can be done differently and they can be done at pace, and that change can be enacted.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, that's wonderful, Howard. Great information. So we do have to wrap up the panel. If I could just ask both the panelists just to share, if you could share one piece of advice or wisdom that we haven't spoken about yet to the audience around being successful with balancing transformation and digital experience. What piece of wisdom would you share? Rohit, do you want to go first?
So my motto to the team was that serve others the way you would like to be served. So the bottom line would be that keep your human touch, whatever we may do in terms of technology or experience or tools or transformation, keep the human touch alive. People still love what I call TLC, tender love and care. So give it to them in whatever form and they'll be your best friends. So finally, end users and IT teams were actually seeing eye to eye and they could share a drink together.
Wonderful. Howard, how about you?
I think that's a great message. I think I'd add to it that, as I say, the lockdowns and what's happened over the last few years is an amazing catalyst for change. And I think it's a great opportunity for IT to make some of those fundamental mindset shifts and technology shifts and start on that journey, which, as I've said a few times, can be iterative and move towards your end goal rather than it being put in the too hard to do pile.
Wonderful. Well, Rohit and Howard, I can't thank you both enough for sharing your wisdom and guidance with us.